Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, let me just kind of go straight there so you can see. I spent you can say part one. This is actually part two because I didn't finish the chapter. And this portion here, it's kind of there's a lot of layers to it, and one of them of which is kind of ironic. You can almost say Saul's final nail in the coffin, but it is over an attack. I mean, a command that God gives Saul to attack the Amalekites. And look at verse 3. And it says, "Now go and attack the Amalekites and completely destroy everything they have. Do not spare them. Kill men and women, children and infants, oxen and sheep, camels and donkeys." And of course, probably one of the most objectionable parts of this is the children and infants that people have the hardest coming to grips with. Some of the other commands you will see in different times, God will say, kill the women who have not slept with men. Now, it will be easy to say that one of the reasons why is that every nation around Israel was extremely wicked. And they were paganism, violence. But of course, the women and children was the most objectionable, right? In other words, people find it the most objectionable with that statement. And as I said before, I do not believe any answer from mere man, right, would be satisfactory. I did go into some of the reasoning that I would say, if I wanted to give a reason, plain and simple, God is God, period. I did, and I think it's important to kind of understand, I guess, some of the broader scope to me of eternity and things like that. But like I say, I don't think any of it is satisfactory. So I'm going to start back at verse 1 again and we go on. But I just, again, we did deal with that. If you want to probably kind of go back into 1 Samuel 15 part 1. I'll give a little more explanation. Like I say, I'm not sure that it is, it would be satisfactory. I'm talking about women and children, the killing of women and children, the ordering of the women and children. Of course, then there are other, there are other layers to this, that God is ordering his people to kill children and infants, right? Okay. So like I said, I kind of dealt with that. I won't belabor that because we literally can go on and on and on and on. And in the end, as I said, I don't think it would be as satisfactory to those critics of the Bible. Okay, verse 1 again. Samuel told Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people." Now listen to the words of the Lord. And I said this before, that if there was a second chance for Saul, if you remember back in chapter 13, Saul failed when he took upon himself to make burnt offerings to the Lord. And at that point, God said he was rejected as king. So, and I said, as we go in this chapter, this would be the final nail in the coffin. But part of what I said too, with respect to this whole perspective, is God is sovereign. Which is not as objectionable to people because I don't know if people really concentrate on it. The fact that God just was, I'm not having mercy on Saul. And yet when it comes to David will commit a heinous crime. He will commit adultery. He will then lie, try to cover up. Then David will order the execution of one of his top army guys, Uriah. That in turn will cause wicked Joab to also cause a couple of the other soldiers to be killed. So David's sin was great, but yet God had mercy on David. And in this case here, it almost seems like, and I'm gonna put the emphasis here, that it seems like God is like, I'm just not gonna have mercy on Saul. Now, I will say this before I move on, and that is, keep this in mind, God, we are not owed mercy. If we could be just before God, we could demand that. Man is just not nowhere near to be able to demand justice. Okay? But if we could, that would be the only thing. But we're not owed mercy. When we sin against God, it is in God's province to be merciful or not to be merciful. In Saul's case, he chose not to be merciful. All right, but let's go on. Verse 2. This is what the Lord of hosts says. I witnessed what the Amalekites did to the Israelites when they opposed them along the way as they were coming out of Egypt. Now go and attack the Amalekites and completely destroy everything they have. Do not spare them. Kill men, women, children, infants, oxen, sheep, camels, and donkeys. Then Saul summoned the troops and counted them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and the 10,000 men from Judah. Saul came to the city of the Amalekites and set up an ambush in the Wadi, and he warned the Kenites, since you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came out of Egypt, go and leave, get away from the Amalekites, or I'll sweep you away with them. So the Kenites withdrew from the Amalekites. Then Saul struck down the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is next to Egypt. He captured Agag, king of Amalekites, alive, but he completely destroyed the rest of the people with the sword. Saul and the troops spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, cattle, choice animals, as well as the young rams, and the best of everything else. They were not willing to destroy them, but they destroyed all the worthless and unwanted things. Now, kind of interesting, because what is implied here is that they did destroy the women and infants. They kept the best sheep, but they spared the king. Verse 10. Now, I said, if there was a second chance, this would have been it, but Saul blows this. It says, then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from me. He has turned away from following me, and has not carried out my instructions. So Samuel became angry and cried out to the Lord all night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and confronted Saul. Now we're going to come back to Samuel's plea to God. Okay. When it says he became angry and cried out to the Lord, he wasn't angry at the Lord, probably angry at Saul, but he did cry out to the Lord. But we'll come back to that in the next chapter. Verse 12, early in the morning, Samuel got up to confront Saul, but it was reported to Samuel, Saul went to Carmel, where he had set up a monument for himself. Now, so again, we're already seeing how bad Saul is. So he's full of himself. So it says, then he turned around and went to Gilgal. And when Samuel came to him, Samuel said, may the Lord bless you. I have carried out the instructions, the Lord's instructions. Samuel replied, then what is the sound of the sheep and cattle I hear? Saul answered, the troops brought them from the Amalekites and spared the best sheep and cattle in order to offer sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest be destroyed. Now, absolute lie, right? That's not why he spared them, for the sacrifice. And then, of course, what about the king? Why did you spare the king? And by the way, the king with a wicked king. So in other words, if you kill the women and children, why would you spare the wicked king? So my point is, this kind of shows the wickedness of Saul. Stop, Samuel. Exclaim Samuel. In other words, just stop with your lies. Stop with just, And I think every one of us at one point have been in a place where we have talked with someone where you just, please stop talking. He says, stop, exclaimed Samuel. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Tell me, he replied. You really don't want to hear. But since you asked, verse 17. Samuel continued, although you once considered yourself unimportant, you have not become the leader of the tribe of Israel. Have you not become the leader of the tribe of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and then sent you on a mission and said, go and completely destroy the sinful Amalekites. Now they were very, very wicked people. Fight against them until you annihilate them. So why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you rush to the plunder and do what is evil in the Lord's sight? And here's the lesson too, that God would have given them 10 times more the plunder, more of the cattle, right? More of the sheep. Verse 20, but I did obey the Lord, Samuel answered. I went on the mission the Lord gave me, and I brought back Agag, king of the Amalekites, and I completely destroyed the Amalekites. So let's stop right here, because this is always amazing to me when people, at this point, Saul is deluding himself. So what was the command? Well, what did God tell you to do? He said destroy everything, and especially the wicked king. He certainly did not tell you to spare the king. So verse 21, the troops took the sheep and cattle and the plunder, the best of what was set apart for destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Well, even if that's true, you were the king, you were the leader. You should have led them. You should have told them, no, that is not the Lord's instruction. Verse 22, then Samuel said, does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offering and sacrifice as much as in obeying the Lord? Now right here becomes one of the prime directives right here. Look at you think about all of the burnt sacrifices right here. He said, does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifice as much as in obeying the Lord? Look, to obey is better than sacrifice. To pay attention is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, or in the old King James, witchcraft. And defiance is like wickedness and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he hath rejected you as being king. So that's kind of the final nail in the coffin for Saul right there. But it also shows his heart. The reason why he rebelled is because he's a wicked person himself. And this is interesting because I want you to see this now, what's going to come up, because notice after he tells him, you are wicked, plain and simple. This is why when you go back to the first failure, right? Not only did he not wait, Samuel said wait 7 days. Not only did he not wait, but then he took things in his own hands. I'm going to do this. So now the same thing. He takes things in his own hands. Well, I know God told me to kill everything. I know God told me to annihilate and destroy everything, but I'm going to spare Agag. Now, whatever that reading is, right? But I'm going to spare the king, the very wicked, sinful king, and I want to take the plunder for myself. And even if it was true, which is not, I'm going to give this to God, right? That's the sin there. And that's why he says, it is better to obey, meaning to obey God, than to sacrifice. Rebellion is worse than witchcraft, he says. Verse 24. Saul answered Samuel, I have sinned. I have transgressed the Lord's commands and your words, because I was afraid of the people. I obeyed them. Now, this is probably true right here. Okay, I don't know why he spared Agag, but certainly this was partially true at the very least. Verse 25. Now, therefore, please forgive my sin and return with me so I can worship the Lord. Samuel replied to Saul, I will not return with you because you rejected the word of the Lord. The Lord hath rejected you from being king over Israel. And when Samuel turned to go, Saul grabbed the hem of his robe and tore it. And Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingship of Israel away from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. Furthermore, the Eternal One of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man who changes his mind. I want to go on. This statement here, God does not change his mind. I'll deal with this later to make the difference here, because God does change his mind. So what does he mean when he says God does not change his mind, when we have plenty of times where God changed his mind? Okay. Verse 30. Saul said, I have sinned. Please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so I can bow and worship to the Lord your God. Samuel went back, followed Saul, and Saul bowed down to the Lord. Now, even in here, notice this. He says, maybe you look good in front of the people, right? Maybe you look good in front of the people. Verse 32. Samuel said, bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites. Amalek came to him trembling, for he thought certainly the bitterness of death has come. Samuel declared, now this is why, now think about, this is who Saul spared. Now watch what he says. As your sword made women childless, so your mother would be childless among women. And he hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilead. Samuel went to Ramah. Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Even to the day of his death, Saul never again visited Saul. Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted he had made Saul king over Israel. Now, what did he mean by this regret stuff right here? There's a couple of things here that's really to unpack here. So, when God makes a decree, and this is the best thing, because there are things that God has prepared. For example, remember God commanded the firstborn of Israel to be priests, but then he changed that to the tribe of Levi. So my point is that there are things that God changes his mind on, but when God makes a solid decree, that's when it becomes unalterable. Okay? And the sad thing here is, notice he says, and again, we don't often have a lot of information because this is not the focus, but the kingdoms around Israel were extremely wicked. So he says, that's why he says this guy Agag was a bad guy. So the question now is, why would Saul spare him? Now we have that even today. Look at what's going on in a lot of churches today, how they spare, how different leaders spare wicked leaders. The list would be too long to go through in terms of just in Christianity alone, how they cover for these wicked people who have raped people, priests who have raped people. The stories in the news right now, how, the church covered up. So we see it here with, I'm not sure why he spared him. I'm just not sure why he spared him. But all right, we're going to move on. Chapter 16 in the next study. I'll see you then.